Well, Abby, thank you so much for coming on the Mindful Mama podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I mean, as I was saying to you, your book is so fascinating. So, Abby followed four women through the first year of motherhood in Finland, Kenya, Japan, and the United States. And you write about how these mothers, kind of no matter where they live, they all had kind of a moment of reckoning, like, I can't believe I'm somebody's mother now.
Mhm.
So, what struck you about this transformation and how did it resonate with your own experience?
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting, just sort of like to a person, how similar the reaction was to suddenly, being a mom and having a baby. And it was interesting because I'd sort of followed them preparing for it. Like I felt like they sort of thought they were mentally ready. They had thought about this moment a lot, but then when it actually came and there was like a real human in front of them and they then were this person's mom, it was just sort of it was completely transformational. And I think none of them, despite all the preparations, were really prepared for that moment. And it was really incredible to sort of watch it and watch how women from different cultures, from different backgrounds. I mean, it was just fascinating. And it may not be like 100% universally true that this is how it happens, but I found it really interesting that that was sort of the first thing was like, wow, I'm someone's mom. Like, how is this? How did this happen? Um, and it totally resonated with me. I felt very similarly when I had my first child. Like I sort of thought I was ready for this, and but like here we go,
Yeah.
and there's no going back. And yeah, I think it really humanized each of them for me in a way, and sort of made them really relatable, and also just across cultures, just incredible how similar we really all are fundamentally.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I remember the experience of like just being like, oh my God, there's another whole person in this room. There were four people in this room. Now there are five whole people in this room, and just being like
Yeah.
blown away by that piece of it. And then, of course, everything else that followed kind of blew me away too.
Oh yeah, no, this is only the beginning. It prepares you to be blown away yeah, over the months and years that follow, for sure.
Yeah. It's really, really interesting. So you had your first baby in Japan,
Hmm.
which was a really bold choice. I think you were like, here I am. I have no family. My husband has no family. You guys were doing work there.
Yeah,
You're a
yeah.
journalist. He was.
Mostly his work. Yeah, he does solar energy stuff, and we sort of moved for his job, and I figured I could also work there. But yes, yes.
Yeah, and there's no family. It's all completely outside of your culture. How did you feel about that decision before you went into it, and then after the fact?
Yes, very good question. I mean, before I went into it, I think looking back, I was probably like largely unprepared for what I was about to sort of undertake, both in terms of becoming a mom and in terms of moving to a place that is so incredibly different from where I was living before. Yeah, so like I said, my husband it was mostly for his job, and we were living in California at the time, and he was sort of going back and forth to Japan, and I was pregnant, and it just sort of increasingly felt like, okay, maybe it's like this sensible thing to do, that instead of having a newborn and he goes back and forth, like we are in the same place. And going to Japan, I could also work there. I'm a journalist. There's all sorts of reporting I could do. And Japan sort of famously has great maternity benefits and all that sort of stuff. So I think it was in some ways felt logical, and I justified it, and I thought maybe this would be like kind of a cool adventure. Um, and yeah, I think it wasn't until I actually had my baby. So we moved when I was 6 months pregnant, and so pretty soon after, like there I was in this hospital in Tokyo with a new baby. And I just remember sort of looking out over the city of Tokyo afterwards. There was a balcony in the hospital, and it was just so immense and so unfamiliar. And I was like, what have I done? Like, I have this baby. I'm in this place. I don't have the support. My mom was coming the next week or something. I think we timed it so she would be there like soon after. But yeah, it was like, it was a lot. And um, it sort of continued to be a lot. There were a lot of things that were really hard about raising a baby you don't have, in a place that's not your own country, I didn't have the community support. And there are just ways in which cultures think about raising kids that you don't really understand until you're in it that are different. And so just sort of trying to figure out how to do it when I had all sorts of different inputs, like both from the Japanese way of doing things and the American way that I was reading online, and just sort of being like completely overwhelmed by the entire thing. It was hard. But on the other hand, like some of those maternity benefits that I sort of knew theoretically beforehand, they did kick in and they were super helpful. There was all this support for women and these like beautiful community centers staffed by retired people who would like sing to the kids, and you would go and there were
Oh.
public health nurses there, like, and I would be like, is this a problem, like whatever's going on with my baby right now? And they would always reassure me that things were fine. So
And you could just pop into these centers for free.
yeah, for free. I mean, they're all across the country, and there's a room for babies. There's a room for, at least the ones in Tokyo. I think they might be different in other places, but they are everywhere. Room for babies, room for like teenagers.
Oh
And
my gosh.
my kids, I remember, I mean, it was really pretty amazing. There was one that had like a drum set for the older kids, and even like these little recording studios. I mean, there's a lot of focus on making sure that families are supported, and there are these government programs that think about ways to connect mothers, and this is sort of one of them. There are these meetups, and this was something that the Japanese woman I profiled made use of, and ended up meeting like a really tight group of moms at one of these places. And it just is, a way to build that support, and it's publicly funded, and I don't even think it costs it's like some tiny percentage of the overall government budget, but they're used a lot. Like, Japanese people, I can't remember the stat, but it's like most people use them at least once a year or something. They're great. Yeah.
That's amazing. And that's got to be, of course, so different from the way a lot of American moms experience things. I had my daughters at a freestanding birth center here in Delaware,
Oh.
and they had like just weekly pop-in class, like meet, moms groups
Hmm.
that I would just go to. And so I met all the moms who had babies the same age. And I'm still friends with at least one of them. I just
Yeah.
went to visit her in South Carolina. And just, I had a good time dancing with the daughter who's now 18 that I was a baby, when she was a baby. So
Yeah.
that was like one of the most supportive things that I could have had. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, I hope everybody has this. But that's not true, right? That this is not something that normally happens maybe in the US.
Yeah, no, that seems fortunate. I mean, there are different community groups that set up stuff like that, but like the mother I profiled in Utah, I mean, she had virtually none of this seemingly. She was pretty much alone for those first few months, and I think she actually relied sort of more heavily on social media to sort of, there were mothers groups there where she was connecting with people, and there were a few friends she had previously who had babies, but I just got the sense that it was pretty, I guess I would say lonely. I mean, I think she even said like I was sort of so desperate for conversation by the end of the day that I was so happy my husband would come home just to have someone to talk to, like just intellectual stimulation. And I don't think that in the US there's the same sort of priority, publicly funded or otherwise in some ways, put on the needs of mothers to have that community support and that socialization, and that all the ways in which knowledge is passed down through generations too. I think that's really important, sort of having older women around you or older people who have gone through this before, previous generations. It's obviously like so much to learn, particularly in those early days, about how to be a mom, and learning to trust yourself, but also, there's all sorts of practical tips that get passed down. And if you are cut off from those things, you don't have those same advantages. And it can lead to a lot of, I think, sort of, mental anguish, honestly. You just sort of
Mm-hmm.
feel alone and you don't know sort of where to turn. And that was the sense I got from Sarah in Utah, that she just really didn't have a lot of that stuff. And there were other countries that just did a much better job of that.
Yeah, yeah. You talk about, you describe Finland. Wow. So just to kind of like look at like where the bar can go, the Finland. wasn't it completely free for mothers to anyway,
Yeah.
you'll correct me. And it also tells moms to take care of yourself so you can take care of the child. And it has this different, has this community kind of postpartum care. Can you tell us about what it was like in Finland following that mom?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I mean, they have this maternity system that's sort of a national point of pride, and it's like a century old, and it's really well organized, and pretty, like 99% of Finnish women use this public system. And so she did. There are things that happen even before you have a baby. There's these programs where you go and talk over. It's essentially like a therapy session, but not but you sort of talk about how you want to be a parent and how you were parented, and the idea is to like break generational trauma in order to,
Wow. Go
stop.
Finland.
I mean, it's really
Oh
incredible,
my
and now
God.
they're trying to expand it to men and non-birthing partners because, of course, like there's a huge need there. So that even happens before, and then yeah, and then the um, birth is publicly funded, and then afterwards you meet with the same public health nurse at your local clinic, sort of for your child's entire childhood. Essentially, they follow you, so you're always going to the same person pretty much, so they get to know you. And they do have this philosophy that I saw the public health nurse talk to her about. It was she was having a little bit of trouble with breastfeeding early. There were some issues, and that affects sleep, obviously. And so she was like pretty ragged. And the nurse just said to her, like, you need to make sure you're taking care of yourself before you take care of the baby. And I don't think that viewpoint is totally unique to Finland, but there was something about it coming from the public system that was like, we value mothers in this system. You're an essential part
Yeah.
of this. It's not just about the babies. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's totally true. And it allowed her a little bit of, I don't know, like confidence and leeway to sort of,
If you had
uh,
that authority figure telling her that, this is
right.
something we talk about a lot here, but yeah, it's hard for people to believe it unless people,
Yeah.
the culture is telling you that, right? The
Yeah,
whole
right,
culture.
right, right. That you're important and your needs are important. And I think
Hmm.
it really like alleviated a lot of her stress. And she sort of like approached motherhood that way. Like she was a great mom, but also like an empowered mother. Yeah. It was
That's
nice to see. Yeah.
That's so cool. And it's really interesting that then let's look at Kenya a little bit, because even in Kenya, there where the circumstances are very different, the government may not be as wealthy as Finland and Japan, but they still have paid parental leave,
Yeah.
which we don't have in the United States, which is so frustrating. Anyway, tell us a little bit about Kenya.
Yeah, it's totally true. I mean, it's like that the US is the exception here, but like really seeing it around the world, it's like, wow, the US really is the exception. I mean, yeah, the mother I followed there, Chelsea, she got 3 months paid leave. And she was like, well, I wish it was more, which you can understand. And there are activists there, advocates pushing for more because, it should be more probably. But yeah, so she got 3 months, she went back. Um, and their system of care is sort of, there's like as far as the birth and maternity care, it is all publicly funded. But it's pretty overextended
Mm.
because it covers everyone. So there's still a bit, and you see this in the US as well, of this sort of two-tiered system. So people with more money do get better care. They've modeled some of it on the private healthcare system and health insurance system of the US. So we're sort of exporting that in some ways there, which is, creating a similar system to what we have, where some people get better care and it looks like an American style hospital birth. And then some people are in the public system, which can be pretty overcrowded. And that's, not as great. But, she had something sort of in the middle, and didn't have access to pain medication because it was too expensive. But besides that, it was similar to what some of the other women got. And then yeah, she went back to work at 3 months. She had some trouble sort of following that, going back to work, because they were supposed to have protections for working mothers, and it sort of fell apart. And she had to go home to take care of her sick child, and her boss got upset and said she wasn't sort of sufficiently committed to work. So These systems are they're new. A lot of these laws protecting moms there are new, and so they're not always enforced the way they should be. But they're working. There's some really incredible activists. I spoke to a member of their parliament who's working to like push this stuff forward. And so, yeah, I mean, you do get the sense in a way that you don't in the U.S. always that there's like momentum to move it forward. It's not there yet, but there's real, true political will to try to get this, try to make it better.
People,
There's will here too as well, but you just feel like it just keeps getting stuck, like every generation we keep trying and
yeah.
yeah, it keeps falling
There's
down.
will, but we feel a little like we're banging our heads against a brick wall to
Right.
get parental leave. Like
Yes, yes.
now, now we're getting maybe even less. Let's go back to Japan for a minute because I was really struck by the your description of Japan's pain minimizing policies during birth. That was really interesting because I mean, so there was this, you described this belief that the mom and baby will love each other more if the birth is more painful. It was crazy because I opted for an unmedicated birth for both my kids, and I was lucky. I was really, my body's really healthy and strong, and I was able to do that both times. Second time was better with a water birth, but and hypnobirthing. Shout out to hypnobirthing,
Cool.
but the whole idea of not having an option for
Yeah.
the medication if I at all like that would just enrage me. Oh my goodness. what what was your experience, and then can you tell us about this sort of cultural policy or that's
Yeah. No, it's totally fascinating, and it was as surprising to me as it was to you when I moved to Japan and realized this was sort of how it was. I mean, the idea is that I
hugely
think
pregnant? You
hugely pregnant.
moved. Oh my god.
Right, ready for anything. Yeah. The idea there is that it's like a Buddhist belief that pain bonds the mother and child, and that, right, so there's some virtue in feeling that pain or whatever. And also there's other ideas about like opiates and not using them. But yeah, so the interesting thing just about my experience with this is there there was one doctor there who was basically the sort of OB to the expat community, essentially. And his like two calling cards were that he spoke English and that he provided pain medication. So, and he delivered at three different hospitals. I mean, he was just this like incredible character. He would sort of like race between them at night in his convertible. He was just, I like want to do a profile of this man now. He was great. So I did have the option, and I was glad to have the option. And like you said, there's something about just knowing it's there that's like very important. And I ended up using it with the first one and not the second two, but it was just my choice, which I was great. And yeah, I mean, for other Japanese moms, and so the mother I profiled did not have that choice, and it really stressed her out. I think going into it, it was like she was having nightmares about the pain, and people had told her how terrible it was, and I think there's this other element that you sort of know that it's a possibility. Like she's aware that the rest of, like in the US, this is an option. So sort of not having it be an option there, I think is really hard. And, her husband also wasn't there because it was sort of the tail end of COVID. And so she was alone, without medication. And I think it was a very difficult experience for her. So yeah, and there's something about it that's says something about the larger society, obviously, like how much we care about women's pain. In this case, whether we're willing to like create a sort of narrative around it to justify women's pain, which is like another sort of level of accepting women's pain. But the other thing that I thought was interesting was how it made me reflect on the American experience and the American approach to this stuff. And Sarah, the American woman, was pretty set on not having pain medication in her birth, and her doctor was very supportive. But in the end, she ended up, I think, getting pitocin or something that made the contractions worse, and so she ended up opting for pain medication. But she felt sort of, I think, a little bit disappointed that she had to do that, and there was some way in which I felt like I don't know, there was this sort of other expectation that she put on herself that she should have to feel the pain. It wasn't the same as what the Japanese women
Hmm.
were experiencing, but I mean, there is just all of this stuff wrapped up in how we approach the pain of childbirth and how we think about it and how we think about whether or not women should have that choice. And feminists have sort of approached it differently through generations. It was sort of embraced, and because it was something that allowed women to create the experience they wanted, and then it was sort of, you know, sort of fell out of favor when people were thinking about it, as far as then being part of the medicalization of birth. And then it's sort of now, I think we've come around again to thinking about it as a choice. And it just, I find that it's such a rich subject to think about. And I do ultimately come back to sort of what you were talking about. It's nice to know you have the choice and this is an experience that's yours and you can sort of determine how you want it to play out.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you would be encouraged, I mean, in some ways, I was in like I was in this birth center where, we didn't, you didn't want to have a lot of interventions or Pitocin and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. None of us wanted that. But the whole idea of thinking that it's just not even available, it really does say something about, are you valuing the mom? Are you how much is if men had no drugs available for a colonoscopy, like that that would
Yeah.
be horrible, and that would be rightly seen as like some kind of torture, right?
Yeah.
That we're just choosing not to offer men these drugs for a colonoscopy. Yet I don't know. And I mean, there are benefits to maybe not
Mm-hmm.
going the medicalization route, right? Like in
Yeah.
that you recover more quickly and the birth can be easier in some ways. But yeah, it strikes me as devaluing of women, which is very frustrating.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, it just speaks to all of these bigger things. Like, I mean, I think making informed decisions is sort of where you want to put
Hmm.
women. They can sort of think about the cost benefit analysis and make these decisions and, yeah, like have it be available. And I think there is some amount of mental stress you put on people just even in, not having it there as an option. I saw it in Japan. I saw it in Kenya. She was sort of negotiating the whole time, like, well, how much does it cost? And can I get it? And it's like, just the stress of thinking about that as you're
Mm-hmm.
going through this like very intense physical experience. It's a lot to put women through, and as you say, like absolutely men would not even, this would not be a consideration, like not allowing pain medication for something like this. So yeah, it's fascinating, and it really does speak to just these much larger themes about how we treat women.
So let's go to after the birth. And as we mentioned, the US is one of the only countries without paid parental leave. Um, what are going to that issue of the parental leave? What are the forces that have kept that way? And how is it, how is it shaped? Looking at American moms like Sarah, you said she was alone.
Mhm.
Is that a piece of that?
Yes, I think that's definitely a piece of that. I think having short paid leave is, it's very isolating because there's not a lot of other women in the same boat as you because people go back to work so quickly. So that's
Or even
part of
your
it.
partner, right? Like
Or your partner.
the
Oh, yeah.
paternal leave. I mean, to have my husband home for 6 weeks was amazing. Like that we were able to do
Yes.
that.
Yes. No, that's huge, right? And we're not even like talking about, I mean, very small conversations about men at all. We're still like thinking about the women. So, yeah, I mean, there's been a movement in this country to push for paid leave for a very long time, dating back to like World War One, like over 100 years ago, people were trying to get this. And this is around the time that the first countries were like Finland was starting to put in place their policies. So, this has been going on for a long time. And in the beginning, it was, the forces working against it were sort of these cultural ideas about, I mean, they were sort of sexist ideas about women should not be working in the first place. So, like, why are we going to create supports for them to leave the home?
Or
And
white women should not be working in the
exactly,
first
so like
place.
white women should not be working. And then there was the racist sort of aspect of it, which was like, well, black women are expected to work, but again, like there wasn't a lot of initiative at the federal level, the federal government, to support those women working. So sexism, racism, and then once the 70s came around and it just became impossible. Well, for most families, they needed two incomes, and so more women were working. So this sort of pressed the issue, and then there was a movement. Corporate interests and business lobbies sort of started to agitate against it and say, there was one quote I found, like the National Association of Manufacturers, they said, we're not going to subsidize parenthood. Like they didn't want to take on the financial burden of paid leave as they saw it. And so that effectively made it impossible, what happened was Congress didn't pass any of these paid leave laws that came up. There were a few of them that came up and they kept sort of not going anywhere. And then finally the FMLA passed under Clinton, but it wasn't paid and it doesn't apply to everyone. It's only big companies and federal workers, so it leaves out like half the population. But the interesting thing that's happened, I found just in the last couple decades, is that the thinking has sort of changed. And so these companies have realized that actually like paid leave is a great thing for them, and that it allows them to attract the best employees, and it allows them to retain them. So you see these big tech companies, like they were sort of leading the way, and it was great. They were saying like, we're going to give 6 months paid leave, and they were showing that all their and it was also to men. So it was like both their female employees were happier and staying, and their male employees, and everyone, and it was great. And then they realized that this was something that was a competitive advantage. So I talked to a congressman who was saying like he was trying to get some of these big tech companies on board with backing a federal paid leave policy, but that they were sort of reluctant to do that in some ways because now they had realized like it was something they wanted for themselves. And
they want to differentiate themselves.
They want to differentiate themselves. Yeah. If you're going to choose where to work, they want to be the ones that are offering these great benefits, which, by the way, are the benefits that like women in Finland and Japan already have, but only a select group of American workers get. And so on the other side of this, you have small businesses that can't compete. And so a lot of the paid leave initiatives, like at the state level, there's been a lot of involvement by small business lobbies to get them passed. Like I was looking at Minnesota, and it was just really interesting. I talked to a woman there who was saying like, there are a lot of people who would prefer to work at a local coffee shop or something sort of local and interesting, but those places can't provide the benefits that like a Target would provide. So they go work for a big company where they're sort of less happy, but that's the deal they have to make. And that's of course a deal that like the women in Finland and the women in Japan did not have to make. It allows a certain amount of professional freedom when you're guaranteed those benefits publicly rather than them being attached to an employer. So in so many ways, these things affect your daily life, just sort of the politics of motherhood. It really, then you have a shorter paid leave and all the repercussions from that, which I saw with Sarah. So yeah, it's really fascinating sort of the history of this stuff and how it's happened, and also just the amount of like advocacy that has gone into it and that it continues to take to get these sort of basic level of supports.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for a small business, you would need to have the government kind of stepping in, maybe state or federal government stepping in to provide some of that funding for these employees for small businesses. Oh gosh, I will hold that up as a North Star sort of for the future. But things have changed a bit, right? Like some things have changed a lot as far as like the role of dads, I think. Has changed enormously, and your book also sheds light on how involved or actually not involved fathers are during that first year. So what did you learn about the policies and the cultural signals that either encourage or discourage dads from stepping in?
Yeah, that was another really interesting thread that I didn't know I was going to sort of pull on when I started the book, but it's so clearly important, like the role of fathers. What I learned was that policy really can lead culture in this way. So it doesn't always start from culture. It often starts with you have a sort of more progressive policy. Like in Finland, they didn't always have these very involved fathers that they do today. there were these policies, and sort of over generations, the past few generations, it's become very acceptable and sort of aspirational now for men to take paternity leave. And the result is like very involved fathers. There's this phenomenon of latte papas, which I loved. And there were these like, it's like these men who are like in the cafes with their babies, and
Aw.
they're seen as sort of like, men want to be them, women want to, be with. They're just like these cool dads, and they show up now in like romance novels and stuff. And so it's like interesting. They're like desirable for being helpful fathers. And the other idea is that like the more you are an active parent, the more proficient you become. So a lot of and that you sort of understand how hard this stuff is. So just sort of anecdotally, that was the sense I got, that fathers appreciated this kind of caregiving work because they were actually doing it. But in that case, you did see the policy sort of leading.
So men have paid parental leave as well?
Men have paid parental leave. It's shifted a couple times in the past few years, but they have. I'm trying to remember, and I think I don't want to get it wrong. I think the couple can take like 10 months or a year, and they can split it between them, so it's somewhat
Oh,
flexible.
neat.
Um, yeah, and it usually is obviously the mother ends up taking more of it, but the father or the non-birthing parent has to take some amount, or they lose it, or some.
Oh,
I
wow.
should know the
Cool.
specifics, but
To
because they
really,
keep refining it, it's sort of changed. But it's that idea, is that, yeah, and so then you have these really high rates of men spending time with their kids. I think there was some stat that it was like they spend more time with their kids, but in any case than mothers. But in any case, they spend a lot of time, and it's just very socially acceptable. And then it was interesting to see like Japan. I mean, I obviously lived in Japan, and I saw there's just still very defined gender roles in a lot of ways, but there is sort of a younger generation of men there who seem, and this is reflected in like polls and stuff, they want to be more involved. But the policies, in a lot of ways, even though they are guaranteed, they're now guaranteed a 1 year paid leave, which is incredible.
wow.
But most men weren't taking it, and it was because there was sort of this corporate culture that if you took it, you would fall behind, and it just wasn't sort of the way it was done. But men wanted to be more involved, and they said this, and the country wants men to be more involved, partly because they want to raise the birth rate. But they put in place this policy like a year or two ago that companies had to report how many of the men there were taking the leave available to them, and then they would publicly um, publish those statistics. And so it was sort of a way of
Hmm.
like doing this public comparison, public shaming of companies that had
Yeah,
low
like
rates.
a pro social shame. I was just talking to
Yes.
Anna Lemke about that. That's great.
Oh, that's funny. And it worked. It
Yeah.
worked. Like the rates have gone up. I mean, yeah, the shaming
Huh.
worked. It worked. So yeah, I mean, I think all this stuff just shows that like policy really leads culture, and if there's probably an appetite for it there, and this has happened in California too. I mean, you see a lot of uptake of the availability of paternity leave there. I think it's like the same percentage as Finland, but
Oh,
it's
wow.
just a much shorter leave. So yeah, I mean, all this, it's really important that men make use of the time they have and that they're given it.
What was it like for the mother in Kenya and then also Sarah, the mother in Utah,
Oh, for the
for parental leave, for,
parental
for,
leave.
for,
Yeah.
for fathers being involved in that first year?
Yeah, Brian, the father in Utah, was like a great dad who wanted to be involved. He is an Amazon delivery driver, and he got essentially no paid leave. And so he took a few days off unpaid, but they, were thinking about how much it was gonna, cost the family and stuff. So it was this real negotiation, like how much can he take off? And so he really didn't take very much time. I think he maybe took the first week, but maybe not even that much. And that
Hmm.
was a lot harder, and it sort of set the stage for Sarah being the primary parent. I think that's the other thing it does, is if you don't sort of establish that relationship early, it just sort of that's what happens. And the interesting thing about that too is that as a delivery driver, he doesn't have the same leave that like someone in corporate management at Amazon would have. They have very generous policies. So there's again that like two-tiered system, and you have some men like him not getting anything, and it completely affects family life. It just made everything much more stressful. in Kenya, I don't think there is paternity leave, but there's some momentum to pass it. I think that's right. In Chelsea's case, the father of her child was sort of increasingly less involved as time went on. So he wasn't really around, and so it didn't really apply to him. But, again, that just meant it was that much harder for her, sort of struggling on her own. And a lot of the traditional support systems there have sort of faded over time as people move to the city and away from, these sort of networks of care. So yeah, it was really quite hard for her.
Yeah, you point out that the moms are overwhelmed and they're blaming themselves for things that are actually societal failures. How do you think reframing that could change the conversation about motherhood in countries like in these four countries or here in the
Yeah,
US?
I think it's really an important thing to realize that you're sort of not operating alone. There's this whole system around you that's either supporting you or it's not. And that's like, your family and your community, but it's also your state and federal government, how much support they're providing you makes a huge difference in your life. So, there's like everything from how safe you feel,
Mm.
like as far as worrying about, I mean, even like the food system or,
Mm.
gun violence, all of that
Mm-hmm.
stuff are things that we sort of take on personally, this, trying to keep our children safe when that really should be the goal of any functioning society is to keep its children safe. And yeah, I mean, just generally, I saw this when I came from Japan to the US, like how much of a burden American mothers felt without paid leave, without universal childcare, which is another huge one. I mean, just the idea that like there could be publicly subsidized childcare, so you wouldn't have to think about it really. The cost of childcare.
Do they have that in Finland? I have a friend who had ended up having a baby and being in the Netherlands and
Mhm.
ended up staying, she said, despite the cost of a $30 roast chicken, because she had like, there were these creche systems where it was completely free childcare from like day one through for however long you needed it. I mean, I was amazed.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It's true. It was true in Japan. Like
Oh,
my
wow.
kids would go there and it's from zero, but because you've paid maternity leave, most kids start around one. And the biggest problem is sort of like crowding and the number. They need to make more facilities, but Japan's actually, they have been responsive and they have built more. And yeah, in Finland, similarly, like there's universal childcare. Most kids start, I think it's around like 1.5. But in any case, just the cost sort of wasn't the issue. Whereas I
Mm.
saw it really clearly that the cost was the issue for Sarah in the US. She couldn't afford childcare locally, so she asked her parents to care for her daughter, and but they lived like pretty far away, so it added like an hour each way in her commute, and they were also getting older, and so she sort of said to me like, I don't know if I could actually imagine having another child because like could I ask them to care for two? And so maybe I'll wait until the older one gets older. But it's like all of these calculations that American mothers are making and that feel like, okay, well, this is just my burden to bear. Like I'm going to sort of intellectually solve this
Hmm.
problem. It shouldn't be our problem to solve. It's a communal problem, that other countries sort of see it that way and have taken steps. So I think that's such an important thing to remember. Like, it's really not you. You're part of this larger system, and if it's failing you, it's important to go advocate for better policy.
Yeah, you can see what's valued by where the follow the money, right? Like there's a
Hmm.
lot of lip service about valuing families, I think, in the United States, but are we giving money to education and moms and dads and families and helping families? No, we're not.
Right.
It's so frustrating. Okay, so you writing this book, you required some deep reporting. You really got to know these four women. I imagine it also involves some emotional excavation. And I'm wondering, like, how did hearing these stories help you make sense of your own journey into motherhood?
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, this work was definitely the product of like a lot of emotion that I had around motherhood. And, it was hard being in Japan and coming back in that transition, but just motherhood in general is a enormous transformational, event. And so I had my friends who I went through it with, but I think there was something about seeing people in like every corner of the globe experiencing similar challenges that was very validating. It was like, this is universally, I mean, it's joyful too. It's incredibly joyful and it's incredibly challenging. And a lot of those things are very common among sort of people everywhere. And so I found it really helpful to see that and also to see that it was a process and sort of following them for that year. I was sort of only barely out of my youngest child's first year, so I was still sort of in it. But seeing how they sort of relaxed over time and it became easier was also like a really powerful reminder that, these things change all the time. And yeah. And just sort of globally then on top of that baseline that's common, remembering that it really does matter sort of where you happen to have a baby as far as what the experience is like. And so like we were talking about, just it can be made much easier if there's more support, if there's more social support, if there's more sort of medical support. All of it just goes such a long way. And so you have this baseline universal biological experience that's happening, but layered on top of that is policy. And so it just really made me feel like I had to go out and do something about it. And I think this book is sort of the product of that, really bringing that message to other people that it's really important that we see motherhood as a political enterprise as much as it is a personal one.
Did you discover any like groups that you would work with or endorse that in the United States that are helping to make policies that are, that are supporting mothers and fathers and families?
I've found the Chamber of Mothers to be doing really interesting work, and they have chapters in I think most states, and they look at all of these issues, paid leave, universal childcare, and they're really trying to sort of organize around them and also create community. So I think that one is really great. I'm trying to think of other
Hmm.
particular support groups, but I would say like definitely look to them and think about joining. Give them a plug. Yeah.
The Chamber of Mothers. It sounds so. It's like, it sounds sort of old fashioned in a like a charming way.
No, I know it's true. I think it might be like a reference to the Chamber of Commerce. Like it's like,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's sort
Okay,
of
that
like the
makes sense.
business lobby, but this is the mother's lobby. But yes.
Well, thank you so much, Abby. This is your book is fascinating. Her book is For Mothers: An Intimate Journey Through the First Year of Parenthood in Four Countries, by Abigail Leonard. It's out everywhere books are sold. It's really fascinating. We talked about a lot of the sort of the big things, but some of the details that you have are so interesting. Just the way people do things differently. I think those are interesting too. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for doing the work that you did and diving into this, and for sharing it with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was such a great interview. Thank you for all your great questions.